In the last chapter, The Borrowers, Pod actually took Arrietty out borrowing, and she was amazed when she looked up into the ceiling because to her it was like way up there. And so he was gathering stuff to make a new brush for Homily, and he told Arrietty that she can kind of go off and just kind of look around a little bit if she was okay, because he knows how to pick what he needs for the brush, and he could probably do it better, faster by himself. Sometimes parents do that. They should teach kids to do things. I'm guilty of it too. But it's faster not to teach. All right, so chapter 8, we'll see what happens while they're out there borrowing. The step, and she's stepping out kind of in the front door. The step was warm but very steep. If I go down onto the path, thought Arrietty, I might not get up again. For some moments she sat quietly. After a while, she noticed the shoe scraper. Now, a shoe scraper is something in the old days they used to have at the front of a house. People's shoes on the bottom, they didn't have treads back then. You know how you get that tread that grips things? It was just a flat piece of leather. So you would put that on the shoe scraper, which was really just a piece of metal like this, and you would just go and scrape mud off your shoe. And it's really great, except for when you have shoes with treads, because then the mud all gets up in the treads and you can't get it off anyway. Arrietty, called Pod softly, where have you got to? Well, I just climbed down the shoe scraper, she called back. He came along and looked down at her from the top of the step. That's all right, he said after a moment's stare, but never climb down anything that isn't fixed like. Well, supposing one of them came along and moved the shoe scraper. Where would you be then? How would you get up again? Oh, it's heavy to move, said Arrietty. Maybe, said Pod, but it's movable. See what I mean? There's rules, lass, and you gotta learn. This path, Arrietty said, goes round the house, and the bank does too. Well, said Pod, what of it? Arrietty rubbed one red kid shoe on a rounded stone. It's my grating, she explained. I was thinking that my grating must be just round the corner. My grating looks out onto this bank. Your grating? Exclaimed Pod. Since when has it been your grating? Well, I was thinking, Arrietty went on, suppose I just went round the corner and called through the grating to Mother. No, said Pod, we're not going to have none of that. Not going round corners. Well, then, went on Arrietty, she'd see that I was all right, like. Well, said Pod, and then he half smiled. Go quickly, then, and call. I'll watch for you here. Not loud, mind. That's another thing parents do, is sometimes kids want to do things that might be dangerous, and they're worried about you doing it, but it's kind of nice that you're being adventurous at the same time, so they kind of let you do it, all right? But they're going to watch you, and that's what Pod's doing here. Arrietty ran. The stones in the path were firmly bedded, and her light, soft shoes hardly seemed to touch them. How glorious it was to run! You could never run under the floor. You walked, you stooped, you crawled, but you never ran. Arrietty nearly ran past the grating. She saw it just in time after she turned the corner. Yes, there it was, quite close to the ground, embedded deeply in the old wall of the house. There was moss below it in a spreading greenish stain. Arrietty ran up to it. Mother, she called, her nose against the iron grill. Mother! She waited quietly, and after a moment she called again. At the third call, Homily came. Her hair was coming down, and she carried, although it was heavy, the screw lid of a pickle jar filled with soapy water. Oh, she said in an annoyed voice, you didn't half give me a turn. What do you think you're up to? Where's your father? Arrietty jerked her head sideways. Oh, just there, by the front door. She was so full of happiness that out of Homily's sight her toes danced on the green moss. Here she was on the other side of the grating. Here she was at last on the outside, looking in. Yes, said Homily, they open that door like that the first day of spring. Well, she went on briskly, you run back to your father and you tell him if the morning room door happens to be open that I wouldn't say no to a bit of red blotting paper. Mind, out of my way now while I throw the water. That's what grows the moss, thought Arrietty as she sped back to her father. All the water we empty through the grating. Pod looked relieved when he saw her, but frowned at the message. How she expect me to climb that desk without me pin? Blotting paper's a curtain and chair job, and she should know it. Come on now, up with you.
Oh, let me stay down, pleaded Arrietty. Just a bit longer. Oh, just till you finish. They're all out, except her. Mother said so.
Remember, her is the older lady that lives upstairs.
She'd say anything, grumbled Pod, when she wants something quick. How does she know she won't take it into her head to get out of that bed of hers and come downstairs with a stick? How does she know Mrs. Driver ain't stayed at home today with a headache? How does she know that boy ain't still here?
What boy?
Asked Arrietty. Pod looked embarrassed.
What boy? He repeated vaguely, and then went on, or maybe Cramfurl.
Oh, Cramfurl isn't a boy, said Arrietty.
No, he isn't, said Pod. Not in a manner of speaking, no.
He went on as though thinking this out.
No, you wouldn't call Cramfurl a boy. Not as you might say, a boy exactly. Well, he said, beginning to move away, stay down a bit if you like, but stay close.
They hadn't told her about the boy yet, right? And he was trying not to tell her, but he accidentally said boy. So now he's like, go ahead and stay down. That'll change the subject. Arrietty watched him move away from the step, and then she looked about her. Oh, glory, oh, joy, oh, freedom. The sunlight, the grasses, the soft moving air, and halfway up the bank, where it curved round the corner, a flowering cherry tree. Below it on the path lay a stain of pinkish petals, and at the tree's foot, pale as butter, a nest of primroses. Arrietty threw a cautious glance toward the front doorstep. Then, light and dancing in her soft red shoes, she ran toward the petals. They were curved like shells and rocked as she touched them. She gathered several up and laid them one inside the other, up and up like a card castle. And then she spilled them. Pod came again to the top of the step and looked along the path.
Don't you go far,
he said after a moment. Seeing his lips move, she smiled back at him. She was too far already to hear the words. A greenish beetle, shining in the sunlight, came toward her across the stones. She laid her fingers lightly on its shell, and it stood still, waiting and watchful. And when she moved her hand, the beetle went swiftly on. An ant came hurrying in a busy zigzag. She danced in front of it to tease it and put out her foot. It stared at her, nonplussed, waving its antenna. Then, pettishly, as though put out, it swerved away. Nonplussed means you're not impressed. Two birds came down, quarreling shrilly into the grass below the tree. One flew away, but Arrietty could see the other among the moving grass stems above her on the slope. Cautiously, she moved toward the bank and climbed a little nervously in amongst the green blades. As she parted them gently with her bare hands, drops of water plopped on her skirt, and she felt the red shoes become damp. But on she went, pulling herself up now and again by rooty stems into the jungle of moss and wood violet and creeping leaves of clover. The sharp-seeming grass blades, waist-high, were tender to the touch and sprang back lightly behind her as she passed. When at last she reached the foot of the tree, the bird took fright and flew away, and she sat down suddenly on a gnarled leaf of primrose. The air was filled with scent. But nothing will play with you, she thought, and saw the cracks and furrows of the primrose leaves held crystal beads of dew. If she pressed the leaf, these rolled like marbles. The bank was warm, almost too warm here within the shelter of the tall grass, and the sandy earth smelled dry. Standing up, she picked a primrose. The pink stalk felt tender and living in her hands, and was covered with silvery hairs. And when she held the flower like a parasol, that's like one of those umbrellas that keeps the sun off of you, between her eyes and the sky, she saw the sun's pale light through the veined petals. On a piece of bark she found a woodlouse, and she struck it lightly with her swaying flower. It curled immediately and became a ball, bumping softly away downhill in amongst the grass roots. You may call those roly-poly bugs. They're the gray bugs that can kind of roll up into a pill, but they're actually called woodlice or woodlouse. But she knew about woodlice. There were plenty of them at home under the floor. Homily always scolded her if she played with them because she said they smelled of old knives. She lay back among the stalks of the primroses, and they made a coolness between her and the sun. And then, sighing, she turned her head and looked sideways up the bank among the grass stems. Startled, she caught her breath. Something had moved above her on the bank. Something had glittered. Arrietty stared. And that's where the chapter stops, and we'll have to see what it was that she saw.